Concerns are growing over China's support for Russia despite its war in Ukraine.
That's right. Experts say the Communist Party there seems to be trying to rally sympathy for Russia. According to the New York Times, it's part of an ideological campaign China is building that paints Russia as a victim, not an aggressor. It also sends the message that Beijing will not turn its back on Moscow. For more on this, let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke.
He's also the interim president of Bellevue College in Washington State. Ambassador, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. We want to start with the message China is sending to its citizens about Russia. It seems to contradict what it's telling the outside world about its stance on the war in Ukraine. What is the reasoning behind this, and how does this kind of campaign benefit the Chinese government?
Well, first of all, China has long been an ally with Russia. We actually formed diplomatic relations with China back in the almost 50 years ago to try to create a little bit of a wedge between China and Russia. And since then, relations between the West and China have been fairly strong. But in the last several years, China has noticed a harsher tone by the United States, whether it's trade sanctions or, tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States, our concerns about human rights. And so China is really trying to forge its own path, trying to reassert itself and form other alliances around the world. And it's really, along with Russia, trying to lessen the dominance and the influence of the West and America across the world. So they've now kind of realigned themselves and are forming tighter partnerships.
So we understand that this is sort of a, complicated triangle. You've got Russia, China, and the U.S. involved. But Ambassador Locke, how does the West's narrative on the war specifically come into play with the fact that despite pressure from other world powers, China has yet to condemn Russian President Putin for the war in Ukraine?
Well, because of its alliance with Russia, and they oftentimes vote as a bloc in the UN, especially in the National Security Council, they are trying to say that the tensions in Ukraine are really, and the massacre really in Ukraine is really the fault of America and NATO moving too close to the borders of Russia and causing the fear and the instability that has led to Russia's response. Now, what's interesting is that the people of China are seeing the images of the incredible massacre, the death, the destruction. But at the same time, China is trying to say, well, yes, this is deplorable, but this is really the fault of the West. They really brought it on with the NATO movements, troops closer to the border, and just what they perceive as saber rattling by America and the West.
So, Ambassador, do you think the accusations of Russian war crimes then will affect China's support for Russia? As you mentioned, we have just been witnessing these horrific crimes throughout the week. All these civilians, scores of civilians killed, some with their hands tied behind their backs.
Well, the Chinese government, through their communist-controlled government newspapers, are saying, well, these are fake pictures put together by the Ukrainian government. And so they are basically following and teeing the line put out by Russia that this is not happening. And now China, of course, is saying this is deplorable, and we urge restraint and we want peace. But they're really not doing very much to help encourage settlement and talks between Russia and the Ukrainian government. So they're mouthing the words, but really doing very little.
Ambassador Locke, really quickly before we let you go, what do you think it will take to change China's stance? Or you think they're digging in their heels, taking this neutral position of sort of supporting Russia by remaining silent?
Well, the good thing is that China is not providing military assistance and economic aid to Russia. And certainly they are aware of the power of the sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia, and that the West could do the same to China. The problem is that Europe itself is not really willing to double down against Russia. I mean, 25% of the oil that Europe depends on comes from Russia. 40% of the natural gas that Europe depends on comes from Russia. They're still not willing to cut themselves off from that. So when they when Russia sells its oil and natural gas to Europe, they're using the money to pay for its military operations, to pay for the replacement of the tanks and the missiles and the artillery and the fighter planes. So, until Europe really gets serious about cutting off its dependence on Russia, how can we really expect China to do much more?
A complicated geopolitical quagmire. Ambassador Gary Locke, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.